Okay, I think we're nearly ready to go. I suppose one of the reasons why I'm here today is that, one, I really do admire the work that's done by Transparency International, but I'm also involved with Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which is an international organisation which is associated with the Centre for Public Integrity in Washington, which is they bring out every American election a book called The Selling of the President, which has a huge international reputation. And besides that, I think when you live in a country like this, you do need a bit of international support occasionally, because it can seem a bit cloistering here. And just for one, I was taking notes while the Minister was speaking, and I was quite struck by his reference to St. Thomas, or who was it? St. Augustine, I think it was. Now, I certainly am no expert in theology at all, but and this was, of course, to do with common good and so forth. But I remember a friend of mine some time ago, when I worked in the Sunday World, which I'm ashamed to say that I learnt my trade there, and someone came up and spoke to us one day about Thomas Aquinas, who apparently once said that prostitution was an essential to a city as its sewers. And those of you who did Freudian analysis can work on that one, but I remember being very surprised at it myself. But we've got a lot of work to do here today, and we've got a very distinguished panel, and I'll introduce them to you now. There's Dr. Jane Suter, who's a political scientist and lecturer at the School of Communications at DCU. She's a founder member of politicalreform.ie. She was on the academic board of We the Citizens. She's a board member of Doylewatch.ie, a former journalist and economics editor of the Irish Times. She's also worked on a number of other papers, including the Sunday Times and the Sunday Independent. And her research interests include political reform, pork barrel politics, and political communications. So I don't know if she ever gets time to do anything else. Must fill up the day for you. And of course, we have Carl Dolan, who's our Senior Policy Officer at Transparency International. He was at the liaison office to the EU in Brussels. He joined the office in 2001, and he previously worked as a policy officer with UK research councils, the European Commission and the European Foundation Centre. And he's also worked as a private consultant on research evaluation, and Carl knows a thing or two about procurement. And of course we have Professor Gary Murphy, who is an Associate Professor of Government in the School of Law and Government at DCU, the former editor of Irish Political Studies, it's the leading journal Political Science in Ireland, and the President of the Political Studies Association of Ireland since 2009. He has written extensively on lobbying, including co-authoring the book Regulating Lobbying, a Global Comparison. So no surprise there, Gary will be talking about lobbying, no doubt. And of course there is Michael Smyth. Michael Smyth, those of us with a memory will recall that he put up 10,000 with his pal at the time, now High Court judge, if I'm not mistaken, and I presume still a pal. But what they did was at that time, they put up a £10,000 reward for anybody who could come up with convincing, I'm not quite sure the definition now, evidence of corruption in local government. And I don't know if you ever paid out the 10 grand, but the country got the Mann Tribunal as a result of it, which lasted a long time and annoyed a lot of people, but did invaluable work. So no surprise, I think Michael will be talking to us today about corruption. But where to start? There's so much in the report and so on. What I was thinking about myself was, all things in politics are local, I suppose, and one of the things, Jane, you looked into that, and it just struck me, there's a new local government bill going through at the minute from the Minister of the Environment, Phil Hogan, and I had a look at it myself, and the first thing that struck me is that it seems to draw a comparison that, now this is a man who's elected by the people to the Dáil, and therefore elected into government, or appointed into government, so but what the bottom line is, it seems to me, is that people are saying that you really can't trust elected politicians, but you can trust appointed civil servants As if there's some DNA that makes one corrupt and the other pure.
Well, I suppose the minister was a local councillor, so maybe he knows more than I do about the DNA. But I think that's slightly unlikely. I think the real problem with the local government bill is that, you know, as the minister said to us there, that there's one of the big things is the centralisation of power and of government here, and how we are one of the most centralised countries. And then here we are going around abolishing more local government, abolishing councils, abolishing town councils, and bringing more power into the centre and more power to unelected officials. So, you know, the sort of the political science idea would be to devolve power out, to bring people more into sort of smaller local authorities, maybe have things like participatory budgeting. And the report has some, you know, sort of fine words about that. I'm sure the officials were able to point to the minister to, you know, all the bits that he was fulfilling in the programme for government. But when you look at the actual detail of it, anything that's actually been done isn't in that direction.
Yeah, but is there this assumption, Jane, that somehow politicians are more likely to be more vulnerable to corruption than, you know, paid officials?
Well, I'm sure the officials in the Department of Environment believe that. But then, you know, when you look at the reports, you know, there were plenty of paid officials who have been...
Who drew up that new law, do you know?
No, I presume, as far as I know, it was a report that was... I see Eamon Ryan in the audience there, he might be able to tell us more, but as far as I know, it's effectively the paper that was in the Department of the Environment when John Gormley was there, and he didn't run with it, and now it's been given a bit of a sort of a gloss and being put out again.
So this was prepared by officials?
Yeah.
You think?
I think so, yeah.
And officials believe that they're more honest than
councillors.
The one thing I can say, and you might know about this too, that in these tribunals, when someone comes to their attention, they have to leave themselves open to all sorts of scrutiny, and all of them, for instance, I would know perhaps a little bit more about the Moriarty Tribunal, but everybody had to open up all of their bank accounts for the tribunals, but not in the case of the civil servants in the Moriarty Tribunal.
Yeah, I have no idea why.
Why would civil servants be immune, do you think, from coming under the same scrutiny? Sorry, have you got any?
Well, I haven't. Well, I have a theory, which is basically that those who seek political office are not secure in employment in terms of, you know, they can be voted in and out by the people, by us, whereas civil servants are immune to that because they have public jobs. So they have a stability and a security that elected politicians don't have. So the theory would be, in terms of the definition that was put up earlier on about entrusted office, or what we would say, you know, political corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain, and the scenario would be that, well, politicians are more susceptible to this because they don't have the security that officials. That's not to say I think that's the right, but I think that's the
do you think that's the thinking behind it?
I presume it is. And there is some literature in this, without boring people, in the international evidence to suggest that, but that's my I think that's the thinking behind it, certainly.
Michael Smyth, you have been following this for what, since the early 1980s or something, sort of aged with it. Tell me, did that ever strike you that there is a greater susceptibility for politicians to be corrupt than for public officials?
Well, I'd be loath to make judgments about people's corruption without some sort of proof, but I suppose I did spend a long time monitoring planning applications and the results, and certainly when decisions were left to councillors, they were very much prey to the lobbyings of vested interests, whether it was on a big scale with developers or in rural Ireland with one-off housing. And I think the big difference was maybe the actual parameters and the remit that was given to officials, and in particular, for example, to Gore Planol, which at one stage a lot of people deemed to be suspect, but I think now it actually arbitrates in a very fair way that conduces to sustainability, and that's because of the task that it's given us. It's obliged to enforce the precepts of proper planning and development, whereas the role of local councillors is actually set up to reflect what we would describe as private interest. But actually, just coming back to your central premise that this new local government reform actually has shifted a lot of power to officials, I wouldn't accept that at all. I think a lot of people have got very confused, and this has been misreported. The central power of local councillors at a local level is over zoning and rezoning, and there's no change being made to that. It's a rather obscure power called Section 140, which used to be known as Section 4, which allows councillors to interfere with the planning decisions that planning permissions as opposed to zonings that officials make that has been removed. But actually that had faded and it wasn't a big issue at all. For example, in Dublin City Council there hasn't been one in 20 years. So I think there's been a lot of hoo-ha over nothing. The balance of power in planning remains with councillors through their power to zone and rezone.
Yeah, I suppose now going on to Professor Gary Murphy, lobbying. Now everybody has an idea about lobbying is that basically very sophisticated, svelte and suave, usually men, go into offices of people of influence and persuade them to do their bidding, and then turn are employed by very wealthy people who will benefit from this.
Well, yeah.
Well, what is the reality of that?
Well, I've written a lot about lobbying and I kind of know a lot about it, but I'll give you lobbying and the registration of lobbyists or the regulation is not the panacea to all the ills of corruption in either the Irish state or in any state international. I'll give you an example. On the night of the bank guarantee scheme, if you had a register of lobbyists, that would not have stopped the banks coming to the government to say, you know, we're in terrible trouble, you have to do something about it. That would not have, no register would have stopped that. But what a lobbying register does is it should shine a light on decisions made by the government in terms of who is influencing them. I was interested to hear the Minister talk about his commitment, which I take in terms of open government, but I was hired, well, hired is the wrong word, but myself and my colleague Ras Chari at Trinity in 2006 to write a report on the regulation of lobbying internationally. We did this in August 2006. Here we are in October 2012. The Minister said it will be published next year. I was at that conference he spoke about in the summer, and there is a rearguard action being fought by lobbyists, and I can, in terms of sectional interests, including trade unions, farmers associations, business associations, that you should have some sort of voluntary scheme. A voluntary scheme is pointless. It's worthless because people won't sign up to it, and some people will and some people won't. You have to have a statutory register, and what you need to know is who is lobbying who, and how much is being paid in terms of that simple question. There is
who lobbies who for what? I suppose.
What exactly? Yeah, but
when you get to that though, I assume the most successful lobbyists are usually those who have ever held high office themselves or have been involved closely administratively with people who held high office. And they're members of political parties, usually in government, just having been in government or about to be in government.
Well, that's true to an extent. That's why we recommend that there is what's called a cooling off period. You shouldn't be able to lobby a former department that you either worked in or that you were a minister for at least, well, in Canada, in some parts of Canada, it's 5 years. That might be a bit extreme for some people. It should at least be probably 2 years, but you need a cooling off period. And it's also about money, Sam. It's not simply about those who held former office, it's how much money is spent. There's a huge literature. The more money you spend on lobbying, the more likely the chances are that you will get the decision you want. And that's at a micro level, but also at a macro level in terms of how the state organises itself, how the state, basically distributes its finances, things on tax decisions, all sorts of ranges.
So the deepest pockets are more influential.
Well, exactly, and that's reasonable enough as long as we know who has the deepest pockets and how much they're actually going into those pockets to lobby, ministers or civil servants. We need to know. A register of lobbyists is crucial, I think, to an open society because it allows the citizens via way of the internet or open access on the web, as I think, from going into government department and trying to wade through these in paper, who is lobbying who and what decisions are made. We need to know that information because once you have that information, you have open government. Because closed government, as we've seen here, causes causes corruption, basically, and the reputation of the state, is at risk. Otherwise, I would suggest.
Yeah. Now, this government's been in office for what now? Not quite 2 years, but heading towards that time, 20 months or something. That anything difficult, controversial that a government needs to do, I think the rule of thumb says it should be done very early in its time. So, when do you think we're likely to get a bill on lobbying?
Well, I think, as the Minister said, sometime in 2013, which is 2 years too late. Jane and myself were involved in a group called reformcard.com, which basically, before the last general election, assessed the manifestos of all political parties, and we ranked them. Now, some people might say, like, who the hell do you think you are ranking political parties? That's fair enough, but we did it, and we scored Fine Gael highest. This accusers have been caused all sorts of things, but the reality is they've done nothing in the 18 months, 20 months.
When you scored them highest, that they were the most successful.
I know that they had the most radical plan in terms of...
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so then again, I was intrigued to hear the Minister today say, that they weren't shy about whistleblowing, they weren't shy about regulation of lobbyists, but there are only two small things. There's a hope, and Jane can probably talk about it more fundamentally than I can. They, in my view, have wasted 18 months wondering of trying to get a chair for the Constitutional Convention. Should the age be reduced from 18 to 17? This is not going to make a blind bit of difference to how the state operates and how the state can regain its reputation. But there's a whole host of things they could do, such as freedom of information could be reformed. We also have obviously lobbying and but a general process of open government, which I think this state hasn't had since it was founded. Jane knows a lot more about it than I do. So.
Yeah, well, there's an international open government partnership that was set up by Obama, and even the British are in it, and it involves publishing data online. We haven't managed to enjoy that, and yet David Cameron and Obama can think that it's not so scary. You know what I mean? That they can do it. The Minister mentioned FOI, but he didn't mention that actually they're rowing back on their commitments on FOI, and so it looks like the charges, it was supposed to go back to the 1997 version before Charlie McCreevy sort of hobbled it, and it looks like that isn't happening. The Garda are being put in, but just the administrative sort of branch, not the actual Gardaí. NAMA are still not in it, and other parts of society which control huge amounts of money. So there's a lot there that they're not doing. I do think though that the Constitutional Convention, the first two measures, reducing the age and the presidency, Gary's right. What on earth difference are they going to make? But I think it would be interesting to see how it works, and it's a really good experiment actually having citizens, ordinary people, rather than vested interests involved in policy making, and that's quite radical for Ireland. I think that's to be...
Well, it is, but we'd better move on to some other things too. Carl Dolan, if you're in mastermind, it would be procurement, I suppose, would be your choice, would it?
I would hesitate to call myself hesitate to call myself a mastermind on anything really, but
it sounds like if you were on mastermind the team.
But actually, I'd just like to come back on the point of lobbying, actually, because I think it's a sort of special pleading on my behalf, really, working in the Brussels office, but not to ignore the EU dimension of this, and I'd also like to sort of second Professor Murphy's point about a lobby register is not a panacea. The EU has a long experience of this. It has a voluntary, or has had versions of a voluntary register since the mid-90s. But it is an important piece of the puzzle. So it's an element which allows civil society to monitor what's going on, and they can cross-reference this kind of information with, for example, asset declarations by not only politicians and MEPs, but also by senior officials as well, and check to see what kind of influence has been going on and what kind of conflicts of interest that there are there. And I think that it's also important to note that the lobbying happens at all levels. It happens at local level, national level, and EU level. So there's no point in getting the national legislation right, or the national system right, anti-lobbying system right, if it can be then bypassed and you can go straight to Brussels and do your lobbying there unimpeded. For example, the IFA, I noticed, is not registered on the Brussels Transparency Register, and it's highly implausible. For example, the IFA is not lobbying on, for example, SIPCAP and other...
as opposed to the FAI, I suppose we're talking about the farmers who are... It's the farmers you're talking about.
Oh, sorry, the FAI, sorry, big point.
Oh, the FAI.
The Irish Farmers Association. Sorry, yes.
No, it's the farmers who are the most successful group, I suspect, to have gained so much from Europe, I think, through the years, through, I presume, intensive lobbying. But do they not get the government to do their lobbying for them?
No, they lobby government all the time. They lobby government constantly. They have open access to the Minister for Agriculture. They've been central partners since the 1960s. Like, the point I would make is there's nothing wrong with lobbying.
Absolutely.
Lobbying is
Everybody's
open.
entitled to.
Exactly. It's open and democratically protected in the American Constitution, in our own Constitution. There's nothing wrong with it. But there is something wrong with it if it's done in secret and it causes decisions to be made which are against the public interest for private gain. That is where the critical point is. It's quite appropriate for the farmers to defend themselves and to lobby both in Ireland and in Britain and across Europe, the United States. But it's also appropriate for environmental groups to lobby. And that's the point I was making about the deep pockets. Some groups have deeper pockets to engage professional lobbyists and professional lobbying firms. That's where we come in, Sam, the point you made about people who had worked for government or had been ministers. But there's nothing wrong with it, but the point is we need to know more about it. We need to know who is lobbying who and what decisions resulted from that. I guess then we can make a decision. Well, did the government act in the public interest in taking this decision, or did they act because they basically had been lobbied by...
In any legislation, though, to cut to the chase, will lobbyists have to declare, one, their employer, two, the position that they're trying to put, and so on?
Well,
and presumably, will there be any reference to any fees that they receive?
Well, that depends how far a state wants to go. In the United States, which has the longest history of lobbying regulation going back to 1946, there is pretty strict regulatory framework about how much you spend, and so spending disclosures are open. In some other states, those disclosures are not made. So it depends entirely on how far a state wants to go, because there is a fear that if you have too much of a what you might call a stringent lobbying regulatory framework, that it will actually stop people coming out into the open. So it depends on how far you want to go.
Yes, you have to go far. Michael Smyth now.
So just to say on lobbying, I think it's important that it should extend not just to the national and to the European, but also to the local, because if he was anything, Frank Dolan, for example, was a lobbyist, it would have been very interesting if he'd had to make declarations of how he was making his payments, I think. But also, I think a lot of the reason for the sloth in the transparency reform agenda can be traceable back to probably the single biggest issue, which needs reform, which is the centralisation of power in the executive. And so the executive is pushing through a reasonably transparency neutral or not particularly progressive agenda, and because there's such a strong majority, there's little enough significant dissent from that. So the chances of a lot of our problems are rooted in that. There really doesn't seem to be any appetite in ceding power from the executive.
Michael, are you a member of An Taisce?
I'm not actually.
Are you now, or have you ever been?
I was a member, but I've reoriented myself.
Have you had counselling?
I spent, I suppose I've technically transmuted into, in quotes, a journalist, so I'd be wary, I suppose, about being a member of it. I was a member of
Is An Taisce not one of the most powerful lobbying groups, along with the farmers in this country?
An Taisce's power, An Taisce has very little power, except to...
But it can get things done.
To make, its power is in the planning process to make submissions, but it happened to make submissions that reflected official policy on such a consistent basis that the powers that be, especially in Bord Pleanála, had to pay attention. The biggest scam in the planning system at the moment is that the rhetoric is good, and the plans actually across the range, from the National Spatial Strategy to regional plans to local development plans, are actually all very good. They say everything that you would wish that they would say, but they're not implemented. They're massively flouted, and it was left to the likes of An Taisce, making submissions in the planning process, particularly to Bord Pleanála, to actually get the plans that, for example, local authorities have done themselves implemented, and the local authorities themselves partly as a result of local representatives being lobbied by vested private interests, weren't actually in the business of applying their own plans. So An Taisce has no power except to make submissions that then were persuasive enough that they tended to be followed, particularly by An Taisce.
Sorry, just because we're pressed for time, just very quickly, Michael, if you could, you, in your experience, and someone who has done some sterling work on behalf of the public, we've had 2 public inquiries at a cost of literally hundreds of millions of pounds. We've had a couple of reports, but have we learned anything from it?
I think there's probably the figure of 86% of people who consider that there's a problem with corruption in the country reflects an increased public perception, awareness of corruption. But in my own experience, I still see there are all sorts of people who tee up obscure measures in the planning process, but the test of a change planning process is the sort of decisions that are coming through. We're still seeing more than 50% of housing is being built one off in the countryside, for example, which just goes totally against all the plans that are created. And you see, for example, on big decisions in Dublin, decisions like the National Convention Centre, decisions like the National Children's Hospital or the Cartels site, a lot of the biggest decisions are actually granted by the local authority in breach of their own plans. So I think that the biggest lesson that we failed to learn is that we should have a system of planning that's actually driven by plans rather than by lobbying. I really don't see any change.
Isn't it funny though, Michael, that a lot of people would be really keen to see a children's hospital at all? Whatever about plans, there's been no sign of it.
Could I just answer your question there, Sam, as well? You ask whether these tribunals, I think, were worth it or not. And I think that's a very valid point. But we always had, and it goes back to Michael and the famous appeal.
There are no consequences, Professor. That seems to be
potentially
someone looking on.
But we always had this idea that there was, money was changing hands, and there was all these rumours. I think what the tribunals uncovered was that there was a spectacularly covert and complex system of payments being made.
Probably a crime, but the police don't do anything.
But prior to these tribunals, there was no idea. People had some idea, but there was no proof of it. What the tribunals have discovered, if nothing else, is that money trail.
One is proof, the other is will. Is there a will for there to be consequences?
Well, I would tend to suggest that there probably isn't, but there should be.
Yeah, I've never met anybody the way who was for corruption. I've never met anybody doing it. Everybody's against it.
The reality is that there's I think we'll hear a lot about this later. There's a shocking lack of prosecutions, again, probably due to cultural problems. I suppose primarily in the DPP's office in dealing with white collar crime. But you also see evidence that there hasn't been much of a public change in their feelings about corruption. For example, Ben Dunn, who was savaged in the tribunal, still seems to feel that he's going to get more customers to his gyms by him being.
He wasn't well at the time, I think. His excuse.
He pleaded that because of mental health problems, his corruption was inadvertent. But neither of those should be the sort of virtues that you'd expect people who are choosing which gym they join with regard as positives.
But as regard to public procurement now, one of the things people regularly refer to here, because it's so obvious and it affects so many people, is every time you go into a pharmacy, it costs Irish people significantly more than it costs in most of the neighbouring European countries. Now that's presumably, particularly those who are getting it on the drug schemes, that's public procurement policies. Are our guys just very unlucky, or are they just not very good at it?
Well, it can be a combination of both. I mean, not all the problems in public procurement are due to corruption. I mean, a lot of it's just due to inefficiency, waste, neglect. I mean, you heard the Minister talking about the need for professionalisation of these posts, and some of it is due to shambolic action or amateurism. But at the same time, there is, corruption and people acting as a result of, explicit cases of bribery and also other forms of
why do we
influence.
pay significantly more? It shouldn't be that difficult to find out that a similar product in France or Italy costs maybe half or a third of what it costs here. Now, yes, it takes a lorry to drive it to Ireland, but not that much. It's really not the stuff that would require, a dozen people for 3 years to work out. Sure, yeah, it could be done very quickly.
Well, absolutely. That's the need for, that shows the need for more public monitoring and to make sure that the contracts involved in public procurement are made available and are open scrutiny for any concerns citizens to look at, or trade groups or consumer groups or whoever. And a large part of the standards here, of course, again, are set in Brussels. We have to remember that there is, again, limited discretion at a national level on a lot of these things. It's not only public procurement, but it's also, we heard about competition, cartels, corporate governance, so lots of these aspects as well. So,
well, for instance, on procurement, something that I was thinking about, and that is, if a pharmaceutical company comes here and employs perhaps 1,500, 2,000 people, which is very good for the economy, does that have a bearing on how much our government is prepared to pay for their products?
Well, I mean, this goes back to the lobbying discussion, I think. I mean, what you want to do, again, this is part of the whole system. You want to be able to look at, again, asset declarations by politicians, the terms of public procurement contracts, how the public procurement process works, and you want to look at lobbying and the contact between the political class and senior officials and pharmaceutical companies, for example.
How could we make monitoring of procurement more effective, i.e. that the public purse pays less for these things?
Well, I think a very simple idea which Transparency International has championed for over 20 years now is the idea of integrity packs. This is something that can be bolted on very easily to the existing processes. An integrity pack is a very simple idea. It just means that bidders for public contracts and the contracting authorities enter into an agreement that they will not engage in corrupt or collusive behaviour in the course of that procedure, and the whole process is then monitored by an independent body or an individual. It can be, as Transparency International, in fact, have done this on several occasions around the world, and it's been shown that this actually saves money. If you look at, for example, huge projects like the Milan subway system or Schoenfeld Airport or public contracting in Colombia, there are millions that are saved in these projects as a result of
an integrity pack. Jane, you, I presume, have looked at the integrity pack. This is a novel concept, I suppose. But it brings you back to something. Are people more driven by altruism or self-interest? That's a pretty big question, I know, at lunchtime on a Friday in Dublin. But,
well, I don't know. The Economist would tell you that it's self-interest and maximising your utility. But then we know that we're not all homo economists as they call us. So I don't know. I think that the jury's out. So it's probably kind of 50-50, and it depends on when you look at the different models.
And
but
people need encouragement from the law to do the right thing.
To do the right thing. Like you heard the minister earlier. Like one of the big things he was saying was this problem with sort of the executive having too much power, how they were going to fix this, and yet you look at all the they set up a sort of a subcommittee of the cabinet where there's 4 people go in and make all the decisions, so they're even centralising more there. So a lot of their actions are even against what he says. Sure. They're going to do out of.
I don't think you have to be altruistic to have greater interest in the common good. I think that there's a notable absence of discourse about the common good in this country. And in particular, I think maybe more could be done on an education level in schools, in whatever they're now calling civics. For example, I think it would be helpful if it became standard practice to teach that that democracy depends on people casting their votes, not for their own vested interests, but in the common good, for example. So I think a lot could be done. There clearly are cultural problems. A lot of this is rooted in cultural problems, and I think education must be the long-term answer, including through civics and at the earliest stages in the school process.
Well, you're very good to mention the minister there. I did take a few notes when he was speaking. One of the things I saw that he said that when he was describing the current malady of the country, he said that we had a heart attack. Then he said we were in intensive care, and I was waiting for him to say, getting better, that we were sitting up in bed eating a soft-boiled egg. But he didn't. He actually said that our hand was still in the dog's mouth or something. And at that, I suppose, ask you from the floor if any of you would like to ask the panel any questions.
Talking about drugs and prescription drugs, the numbers are here, 80% of drugs which prescribed are not generic, when in the United Kingdom 80% are generic only 20% original. I've been working with the Open Government Partnership for the last year and trying to bring Ireland on board, and it was launched just over a year ago by President Obama and President of Brazil. And 8 countries were at the launch, and right now there are 57 countries which joined already, and 2 billion people live in the countries which belong to the Open Government Partnership. And what it gives each country with sign-ups, it commits itself to launching public consultation on development of the action plan, how to make the society much more transparent, much more participatory, and much more collaborative with a greater use of technology. But we're living in the information age, and the data which is collected by government on our behalf and on our expense has to be, first of all, meaningful, and secondly, it has to be in useful machine-readable formats, which is called open data. And in Ireland, it almost doesn't exist.
Well, I think they're making promises along that direction at the minute. There's a gentleman behind you there, I think, was wishing to speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was just going to make a couple of comments. My name is Seamus May from the Irish Small Business Alliance. We've been studying in this general area for many decades now. It seems that there's an absolutely rotten culture in this country, pervades the political parties and the civil service. We have been particularly involved in, say, aspects like whistleblowing. And as I think somebody mentioned earlier, the Competition Authority have a leniency program or a whistleblower program. It's in effect now for a number of years. But to our knowledge, nobody has come forward, other than one that came forward in summer 2011 to expose a very major cartel that has been running for decades in this country and costing all of us very, very substantial amounts of money. Now, the DPP are sitting on this for about 17 months, and they haven't said, yes, we'll give you immunity. And the reason being is that it seems very, very clear that all these big businesses and the people that are well, can I just point out that cartel practices, anti-competitive practices are costing, according to the Competition Authority, they're costing this country €4 billion per year. Now,
Can you give us an example, without defaming anybody, of, say, brand names or names that we would know that are doing this?
The most famous cartel in the world, other than OPEC, is of course the cement cartel. So we can talk to you about cement, we can talk about insurance, ink, there's a lot of...
Well, the name Quinn sort of came up twice there, didn't it, in insurance and cement, so...
Well,
I don't wish to comment either way.
The Competition Authority don't want to know. They have refused point blank in writing to investigate lots of cartels, in particular the cement cartel. And somebody said about pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are way overpriced in this country. It is a competition matter, and the Competition Authority will not look at it because the government will not have them look at it, because you put your finger on it. There is a lot of people employed in pharmaceutical companies in Ireland, and it's good for the employees, but it's very bad for the consumer.
Well, I think the point that was just made was that 80% of the drugs prescribed in the UK are generic, and 80% of them in this country are brand, so I suppose that would explain something.
How long ago is it since Mary Harney promised us all we'd be using generic drugs? It's years ago. It must be 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. No, we're not using generic drugs.
Oh, that's sure. Well, listen, somebody else probably trying to get in there.
If I could just say on whistleblowing, how primitive the regime is here. We had an editor of Village magazine, and we had a whistleblower who wrote an article about breaches of capital ratios by a major Italian bank. The central bank were impressed enough with the evidence that appeared in the magazine that they said that they would treat his information and confidentiality. They issued a statement saying that they expressly that they would treat information on this matter in strict confidentiality. So I was involved, and he was very nervous about giving this information. We probed the central bank a little bit, and in fact, they under probing, they said that they would treat the information in confidentiality unless there was any indication that there'd been perpetration of any illegality, in which case they forwarded the information to the Gardaí. Given that this guy actually had been involved in an activity that he was concerned was criminal, the central bank, no less, the central bank, against the background of all the allegations against the central bank and the regulator, only a year ago were teeing up somebody to give information to them that they were reserving the right to forward to the criminal authorities. So I think there are still very real issues for qualified.
Well, because you know who might help us with that, because we have former Minister Eamon Ryan, who knows a thing or two about government. I think.
Thank you, Sam. Kind of just a couple of points. One, I think the person I noted was it Gary's who said about we have to look at the European level. I think it's absolutely true. And I think in the European Commission offices here, my experience of the Commission is a very good one, but if there's a lack of accountability, it's a lack of democratic accountability in the Union. I think we're going to have to look very urgently at elected President of the Commission and so on to stitch in accountability at the highest level. And I think in terms of transparency, one of the problems with the European Union systems, it's so complex. I remember kind of getting appointed to or put onto the European scrutiny in the Dolan was the equivalent of the salt mines in Siberia. But we need, I think, the Shannon to be reformed, or some such institution, to have an absolute focus on what's going on in the European Union, because at the present time, our political system domestically does not do that. Just in relation to what Jane was saying, the actual previous white paper, which was very close to publication, unfortunately, we ran out of road, from my perspective, to get it out, but it was a completely different plan for local government reform, and it was, in my mind...
Sorry, Eamon, are you saying it's complete? What was prepared while you were in the Department of the Environment is completely different from what Phil Hogan announced last week.
Totally. The one before, the one that John said not to publish, was very similar to it.
Yeah, but we engaged, I suppose, in a series I was personally involved in about 10 to 15 meetings with officials. And there's a natural battle between elected politicians and the system, the permanent government, in terms of where power resides. I think Phil Hogan lost that dramatically. I think it involves a massive re-centralisation of power, particularly the lack of power that's been given to regional authorities. I mean, what Mahon Tribunal was saying is make it directly elected. He didn't do that. What Michael says about kind of strong regional plans, the development of water is centralised, Irish water. The development of waste management under Phil Hogan's plan is centralised. The development of transport is centralised in the National Transport Authority. And even in the instances where the remaining planning at a regional level does reside on statute with the regional authorities, what the plan is saying is that the elected officials shouldn't, they needn't bother looking at those little details by making a statutory submission on the regional plans. It has taken that away from the open democratic arena and put it into a closed door process where the officials will examine, where the very officials that are being examined, their plans, will be involved.
I think actually, if I'm not sure, Michael Smyth might have a different view on that and something you could speak about later, but while we have you here, I will take advantage of your presence. It's just something that's been puzzling me for a long time and goes directly to what we've been speaking about here today, and that is, do you see any connection between one of the persons against whom there were grave findings against in the Moriarty Tribunal had been one of the largest donors to one of the parties in government and the subsequent lack of action?
I think one of the biggest questions is in regard to now the Supreme Court case, or where the some of the parties involved in that, Persona and others, are taking a case against the state, and where it seems a very unusual circumstance where the Supreme Courts are saying they're in a sense agreeing with what the Moriarty Tribunal had said. In those circumstances, you'd have to say, is there a case for the government to try and get a mediated settlement rather than a contested court outcome?
Yeah, well, that's on that issue, that may be a point, but I suppose the point of the question is that the judiciary have made very clear, well, to me anyway, how they feel about all of that, but there's been no subsequent action in politics at all, that the government of the day, it took them all of their time to say that they accepted the findings of the tribunal. And the first point that I asked you is, and one of the largest financial donors to the government is, someone against whom grave adverse findings were made? I.e., does money buy you influence in government?
It would appear that in certain circumstances, yes, it can, and that is probably the largest and the most shocking example of such influence seeming to have had a very real and direct effect at a cost to the Irish Exchequer.
Is there anybody else who wishes to say a word to gentlemen? No?
Very quick question. My name is Edward Stevens, and I'm a member of Transparency. In respect to the Beef Tribunal, which came before the gentleman we've been speaking of, one outcome was that Des O'Malley wanted to examine the civil servants in the Department of Education to hire civil servants. And I remember the union battled that.
The civil service union?
Yeah, the union for higher civil servants. But I might be mistaken. I don't know if anyone followed that issue and whether the minister was basically put back in his box by the officials.
Well, it's members of the higher civil servants union who would be advising the government ministers who are drawing up the terms of the tribunal, I suppose, or their terms of reference.
No, this was after the tribunal had concluded, and I think he wanted to look into some of the connections that had been discovered.
Well, someone, for instance, left as Secretary General in a department of agriculture, and the next Monday they joined, I think, Goodman International or something.
There were, we never got to examine the issues because the union successfully shut down what the minister was trying to do. That's my recollection, but it was a long time ago. You know, the tribunal was over.
Has much changed since then, Gary, do you think?
No, short and sweet. I don't think much has changed at all. And it goes back.
That's 1991. What's that? 30 years?
20 years ago. But the point is, the minister talked about groupthink at the end, and I think the point you make in terms of Des O'Malley as some sort of shining knight trying to hack down the bureaucracy of the civil servants from getting in the way. I wouldn't be terribly convinced of that. But there clearly is a nexus of senior civil servants and senior politicians that have kept this country close in terms of what the citizens know. I think strengthening freedom of information legislation, that's what we need to do, but in fact the opposite has happened since FOI came in. We don't have whistleblowers legislation that is that has any great strength in terms of what Michael says. We don't have a register of lobbyists. These are three simple things that could in many ways transform what the citizens of this state know, and that's what my defence of the tribunals. We now have some evidence, although it's cost billions, that these complex and covert payments were basically how our society was ruled. So in that connection, I think, the more openness, the better for the state.
I think one of the most depressing things about the Moriarty Tribunal after the expenditure of so much public money was, I think, the misreporting in much of the media. I think, quite apart from, and I'm not sure if I can use this word, Sam, the dodginess of Dennis O'Brien, I think that the thing that came through, and maybe it was because there was an earlier report that was sort of collapsed, which referred to civil servants being enthralled to the minister.
You mean the preliminary report, which was subsequently changed to the final report?
But I think maybe as a result of that, the media reportage was overcautious. At the heart of the problems in the Moriarty Tribunal was, I think, delinquency on the part of civil servants who expressed no difficulty with the proximity of the relationship between Dennis O'Brien and Michael Lowry, and I think if anything that was the systemic problem that emerged from the tribunal, but it wasn't really reported, maybe because the dealings of Dunn and Hyde and Lowry and O'Brien were sexier to report on.
I will warn you, as somebody who's received solicitors' letters on occasion to my house where I wouldn't expect to get them.
It's James Morris in the audience.
Be very, very careful about what you say with those people, because no good can come off it. Henry MacDonald, I think, wants to say something.
Yeah, I'm Henry MacDonald from The Guardian. I'm pleased to be here today. I just wanted to ask the panel a big broad question which applies only not only in Ireland and Europe, but will there ever be a Mahon-style tribunal into Anglo-Irish Bank et al? And what good can come from it?
Sure, I think that the time for, rather than a Mahon-style, costing us billions, it would be great to have a sort of a truth and reconciliation type thing where, we can hear what was going on. Now, we were promised that something like that would happen if we had passed the Oireachtas Inquiries referendum. So I'm not sure, but I don't think that there's any great appetite in it. I think there's a lot of the same people are involved in, a lot of the major parties, and there isn't any great appetite for a huge amount of bloodletting on it, which I think is a pity. We do need to move on, but I think you can only do it properly if you understand completely what happened and we still don't even know what happened that night in the cabinet, never mind all of the events leading up to it. So I think it would be very healthy, not a full Mahon tribunal, more a sort of a truth and reconciliation type environment.
Just need Nelson Mandela, I think, to chair that. There's a lady sitting in front of.
Oh, thanks. I'm Kate Kenny from NUI Galway. So just to follow up the panel, the discussion on whistleblowers, my research is on whistleblowing in banking and financial institutions for the last couple of years, focusing on Ireland, the UK and the United States. So just the instance reported in the IFSC that Michael Smyth brought up is not unique in any way to Ireland. So we have the case of, for example, Rodney Birkenfeld, a whistleblower in the United States who was actually sent to jail for coming forward with information on a crime that he'd been involved in. This is the reason he had the information to come forward. And he was, they were unable to offer him the Department of Justice or the SEC in the US immunity. Similarly, the Financial Services Authority in the UK fall into that category of being unable to be clear to whistleblowers in banking about this. So the problem is wider than Ireland.
It is, except we did offer immunity, if I'm not mistaken, to some people at the tribunals.
Yes, but in terms of kind of whistleblowing in banking, the central bank.
Oh, sorry, particularly in banking, but it has been done in the past. You know?
At one point to sort of compel people to come forward. So yeah. But just for the panel, I mean, how seriously can we take legislation even on whistleblowing in banking in an environment in the IFSC where every debate, for example, on financial transaction tax reduces to things like don't scare off the jobs in the financial services sector?
Who's good on whistleblowing yourself?
I'm just again going to make a point not to get too focused on the national context. I mean, Eamon referred to the fact that more and more powers are being transferred to Brussels. Lack of accountability there. To be very specific, in the case of central banking, at the moment policymakers are talking about transferring supervisory responsibilities for Eurozone banks to the European Central Bank, probably one of the least transparent and accountable European institutions. So in this very specific case that Michael brought up, which is reporting breaches of capital ratios, that is going to be now one of the new powers of the ECB to police that. So if you're talking about whistleblower legislation, about reporting of breaches, we have to look at the framework for the European Central Bank, as well as our domestic banks as well.
Well, I think at this stage what we have to do is take a break. Presumably people will want to have cups of tea perhaps and attend to other calls. And listen, I'd like to thank you all very much. I know I'm thanking you all.
Do you know anything about budget submissions?